February 25th, 1956, 2 a.m. Inside the Grand Kremlin Palace, 1,436 delegates of the Communist Party sit in stunned silence. For 4 hours, they have listened to their leader systematically dismantle the cult of the man who ruled them with absolute terror for nearly 3 decades. No Western journalists are present. No recording devices are allowed. The doors are locked. What happens in this room will fracture the communist world and send shockwaves across every continent. This is the story of how Nikita Khrushchev stood before the Soviet elite and told them their god was a monster. The man at the podium is 61 years old, stocky, balding, with a face that looks like it was carved from Ukrainian granite. Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev was born in 1894 in Kalinovka, a village so poor that his family lived in a mud hut with a dirt floor. His father was a miner. His mother couldn't read. By age 15, Khrushchev is working in factories and coal mines, his hands black with soot, his lungs filling with dust. He joins the Bolsheviks in 1918, fights in the Russian Civil War, and claws his way up through the party hierarchy with a combination of genuine revolutionary fervor and ruthless political survival instincts. He serves under Stalin in Ukraine during the 1930s. Overseeing agricultural collectivization. Millions die. He never speaks of it. He helps purge the Ukrainian party of so-called traitors. During the Great Terror, thousands are executed. He signs death warrants. He attends the executions. He survives because he is useful, because he is loyal, because he knows when to applaud and when to denounce. When Stalin dies on March 5th, 1953, Khrushchev is one of the men standing around his deathbed, watching the dictator's final agonizing hours. Some historians believe they delayed calling doctors. Some believe they wanted him to die. The power struggle that follows Stalin's death is vicious but brief. Georgy Malenkov becomes premier. Lavrentiy Beria, the feared head of the secret police, makes his move for ultimate power, but Khrushchev outmaneuvers them both. In June 1953, he orchestrates Beria's arrest. Beria is tried in secret and executed in December. The official who terrorized millions, who personally participated in torture sessions, who raped women with impunity, is shot in a basement. The system consumes itself. By 1955, Khrushchev has pushed Malenkov aside and consolidated power. He is first secretary of the Communist Party. He is the new leader of the Soviet Union, and he is planning something unprecedented. The decision to denounce Stalin does not come from moral revelation. Khrushchev is not suddenly struck by conscience. He is a political calculator, and he sees the mathematical reality. The Soviet system is suffocating under Stalin's legacy. The economy is stagnant. The labor camps still hold millions. The party elite live in constant fear of purges that could resume at any moment. The dead dictator's presence still dominates every room, every decision, every thought. Something has to change, or the system will collapse from within. Khrushchev begins carefully. In 1954, he orders the release of political prisoners. Thousands return from the Gulag, walking skeletons with stories that cannot be silenced. In 1955, he travels to Yugoslavia to reconcile with Tito, whom Stalin had denounced as a traitor. The message is subtle but clear. Stalin made mistakes. Stalin's judgments are not infallible. The old guard senses danger. Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister, resists any criticism of the former leader. So does Lazar Kaganovich, who helped implement collectivization and the purges. They understand that questioning Stalin means questioning themselves, questioning the blood on their own hands. But Khrushchev has allies. Anastas Mikoyan, who survived Stalin by being indispensable and invisible, supports de-Stalinization. So does Nikolai Bulganin. In January 1956, Khrushchev proposes something audacious, a special closed session at the upcoming 20th Party Congress, where Stalin's crimes will be officially acknowledged. The Presidium debates for hours. Some argue it will destabilize the party. Some argue it will destroy the Soviet Union's international prestige. Khrushchev argues that the truth will emerge anyway, that controlled disclosure is better than chaotic revelation. The vote is close, but he wins. Now he needs a speech. He assembles a small commission in absolute secrecy. They gather evidence, testimony from released prisoners, documents from the security files, records of executions, transcripts of show trials. The material is overwhelming. Stalin personally signed execution lists containing thousands of names. Stalin ordered the torture of party members who had been loyal revolutionaries. Stalin fabricated conspiracies and destroyed anyone he perceived as a threat. The commission works for weeks, compiling, verifying, organizing the horrors into a coherent indictment. The 20th Congress of the Communist Party opens on February 14th, 1956. For 10 days, delegates from across the Soviet Union and foreign communist parties attend public sessions. They hear reports on economic plans, agricultural reforms, international relations. Everything seems normal. Everything follows the established ritual. Then, on February 24th, the public sessions end. Foreign delegates are sent home. On February 25th, at 2 a.m., the Soviet delegates are summoned back to the hall for a special closed session. The doors are locked. Armed guards are posted outside. No one is allowed to leave. Khrushchev walks to the podium. He carries a thick sheaf of papers. His hands are steady. He begins speaking in Russian, his voice flat, bureaucratic, reading from the prepared text. The title of his speech is On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences. For the first few minutes, he discusses Lenin's warnings about Stalin. He quotes from Lenin's testament, the document where Lenin, before his death in 1924, urged the party to remove Stalin from power, calling him too rude, too capricious, too brutal. This document was suppressed for 30 years. Now Khrushchev reads it aloud. Then he moves to the purges. Between 1936 and 1938, during the Great Terror, approximately 1.5 million people were arrested for alleged anti-Soviet activities. At least 680,000 were executed. Khrushchev provides specific numbers. Of the 139 members and candidates of the party's Central Committee elected at the 1934 Congress, 98 were arrested and shot. Of 1,966 Congress delegates, 1,108 were arrested on charges of counter-revolutionary crimes. These were not enemies of the state. These were loyal party members, revolutionaries who had fought for the Bolshevik cause, and Stalin destroyed them based on fabricated evidence and forced confessions extracted through torture. Khrushchev reads from interrogation records. He describes how the secret police would beat prisoners for days, breaking bones, tearing flesh, until the victims would confess to anything. He names names. Marshal Tukhachevsky, a brilliant military commander, tortured and executed. Stanislav Kosyor, former Ukrainian party leader, broken and shot. Hundreds of military officers, industrial managers, party officials, all murdered in a paranoid frenzy. The audience sits frozen. Some delegates weep quietly, some stare at the floor. Some feel their own guilt rising like bile. He describes Stalin's behavior during World War II. When Germany invaded on June 22, 1941, Stalin went into shock and disappeared to his dacha for days, leaving the country leaderless at its most critical moment. He ignored intelligence warnings about the German attack. He had purged the Red Army's officer corps, executing experienced commanders and replacing them with political loyalists, crippling Soviet military effectiveness. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians died because of Stalin's incompetence and paranoia. Yet Stalin presented himself as the genius who won the war, the great strategist, the savior of the motherland. Khrushchev describes Stalin's personal cruelty. Stalin would mock and humiliate his subordinates during late-night drinking sessions that lasted until dawn. He would force them to dance, to tell jokes, to degrade themselves for his amusement. He trusted no one. He suspected everyone. He had Polina Zhemchuzhina, Molotov's wife, arrested and sent to a labor camp. Molotov, his most loyal servant, said nothing, did nothing, continued to serve. Stalin created a system where personal relationships meant nothing, where survival required absolute submission and the abandonment of all human feeling. The speech continues for 4 hours. Khrushchev's voice never wavers. He presents document after document, fact after fact, building an overwhelming case. He describes Stalin's cult of personality, how the dictator demanded constant praise, how cities and factories and collective farms were named after him, how his portrait hung in every office and home, how he rewrote history to place himself at the center of every achievement. He quotes from Stalin's own writings, passages of shameless self-glorification that now sound grotesque. But Khrushchev is careful. He does not attack the Soviet system itself. He does not question the fundamental legitimacy of communist rule. He frames Stalin as an aberration, a deviation from Lenin's true path. He argues that Stalin's crimes were individual failures, not systemic inevitabilities. This is crucial. Khrushchev needs to condemn Stalin without condemning the party, without admitting that the system itself generates terror and oppression. He needs to preserve the foundation while demolishing the icon. He does not mention collectivization, the forced seizure of peasant land, the artificial famine in Ukraine that killed millions between 1932 and 1933, the brutal suppression of rural resistance. These topics are absent from his speech. He does not mention his own role in the purges. He does not acknowledge that everyone sitting in this room, including himself, participated in Stalin's crimes. He does not explain how the terror machine operated, who built it, who maintained it, who benefited from it. The speech is a selective accounting, a political document disguised as moral reckoning. At approximately 6 a.m., Khrushchev finishes. He gathers his papers and walks away from the podium. The whole remains silent. No one applauds, no one moves. The delegates sit in shock, their minds struggling to process what they have heard. Everything they believed, everything they defended, everything they justified, it was built on lies and corpses. Some delegates have lost family members to Stalin's purges. Some delegates signed death warrants themselves. The cognitive dissonance is paralyzing. The Presidium has ordered that the speech not be published or officially distributed. It remains secret for party members only. But secrets do not stay secret. Within days, copies of the speech begin circulating within the party hierarchy. Within weeks, party members are reading it aloud at closed meetings across the Soviet Union. Within months, foreign intelligence services obtain copies. On June 4, 1956, the New York Times publishes the full text in English. The world reads Khrushchev's indictment of Stalin. The reaction is seismic. In the Soviet Union, millions of people who suffered under Stalin feel a bitter validation. The regime that destroyed their lives, that took their loved ones, that crushed their spirits, now admits it was wrong. But the admission is hollow. No one is prosecuted for Stalin's crimes. No reparations are paid. The acknowledgement is purely verbal, a political maneuver with no accompanying justice. Stalin's body is eventually removed from Lenin's mausoleum in 1961 and buried by the Kremlin wall, but his statues remain standing for years. His portraits still hang in government offices. The system continues. In Eastern Europe, the speech triggers upheavals. If Stalin was wrong about everything, if his judgments were criminal, then maybe Soviet domination is not justified. Maybe national sovereignty matters. Maybe there are alternatives to the Soviet model. In Poland, workers riot in Poznan in June 1956, demanding better conditions and political freedom. The Polish government responds with force, killing dozens, but then makes concessions, allowing some liberalization. Władysław Gomułka, previously imprisoned as a nationalist deviant, returns to power and negotiates greater autonomy. From Moscow, Khrushchev accepts this because the alternative is losing Poland entirely. In Hungary, the reaction is more dramatic. Students and intellectuals, emboldened by the secret speech, begin demanding reforms. On October 23rd, 1956, a massive demonstration in Budapest calls for democratic changes, Soviet troop withdrawal, and the return of Imre Nagy, a reformist communist who had been ousted for being too independent. The protest escalates the Hungarian security police fire on the crowd. Workers join the uprising. Soviet troops stationed in Hungary initially withdraw from Budapest. Nagy becomes prime minister and announces Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. This is too much. On November 4th, Soviet tanks return. They crush the Hungarian Revolution in brutal street fighting. Thousands are killed. Nagy is arrested, secretly tried, and hanged in 1958. The message is clear. Criticism of Stalin is permitted, but challenging Soviet control is not. In the international communist movement, the speech creates fractures that never fully heal. Communist parties in Western Europe struggle to respond. Italian communist leader Palmiro Togliatti asks how the cult of personality was possible in a supposedly democratic system. He receives no satisfactory answer. The French Communist Party experiences mass defections. Intellectuals who had defended Stalin for decades now confront their complicity in justifying crimes. Some maintain loyalty, arguing that capitalist propaganda exaggerated Stalin's faults. Some break completely, rejecting communism as irredeemably corrupt. The unity of the international movement, always more imagined than real, begins to shatter. In China, Mao Zedong observes with alarm. He sees Khrushchev's speech as dangerous revisionism, a betrayal of revolutionary principles. Mao has his own cult of personality, his own purges, his own intolerance for dissent. If Stalin can be denounced, then any leader can be questioned. Mao begins distancing China from the Soviet Union. By 1960, the Sino-Soviet split is open. The communist world divides into competing camps, each claiming to represent true socialism, each accusing the others of betrayal. Inside the Soviet Union, de-Stalinization proceeds erratically. Khrushchev releases more political prisoners. The Gulag population drops from approximately 2.5 million in 1953 to less than 1 million. By 1960, writers and artists experience a thaw, a limited but real expansion of creative freedom. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn publishes One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich in 1962, a novella depicting life in a labor camp. It is officially sanctioned literature, state-approved criticism of Stalin's excesses. But the thaw has limits. When Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago is published abroad in 1957, containing implicit criticism of the revolution itself, the Soviet authorities condemn it. Pasternak is forced to decline the Nobel Prize. Dissent is tolerated only within narrow boundaries defined by the party. Khrushchev's own position becomes increasingly unstable. His agricultural policies fail. His boasts about overtaking American production prove empty. His erratic behavior, his bombastic speeches, his shoe-banging incident at the United Nations in 1960 embarrassed the Soviet leadership. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brings the world to the brink of nuclear war, and while Khrushchev ultimately backs down, preserving peace, his colleagues view the entire episode as reckless adventurism. In October 1964, while Khrushchev is vacationing at his Black Sea dacha, the Presidium stages a coup. They summon him back to Moscow and present him with a list of failures. He is removed from all positions. His retirement is announced. He becomes an unperson, living quietly in Moscow, forbidden from public life, until his death in 1971. The men who remove Khrushchev, led by Leonid Brezhnev, reverse many of his reforms. De-Stalinization slows and then stops. Stalin is not officially rehabilitated, but criticism of him becomes less acceptable. The Brezhnev era prioritizes stability over reform, orthodoxy over experimentation. The brief thaw freezes again. Dissidents who continue to speak out face arrest, imprisonment, or forced exile. The Soviet system ossifies, becoming a gerontocracy ruled by elderly men terrified of change, presiding over an economy that grows increasingly sclerotic, maintaining power through inertia and repression. The secret speech remains one of history's great paradoxes. It was an act of remarkable courage from a man who was himself complicit in Stalin's crimes. It was a genuine attempt at reform that nonetheless preserved the fundamental structures of oppression. It liberated millions from the Gulag while maintaining the single-party dictatorship. It acknowledged mass murder while refusing to prosecute the murderers. It spoke truth while maintaining lies. Khrushchev stood before the party elite and told them they had worshipped a criminal, but he did not ask them to account for their own crimes. He did not demand justice, only acknowledgement. Was it enough? The question haunts anyone who studies this history. Millions of Soviet citizens died because of Stalin's paranoia, his cruelty, his systematic destruction of human life and dignity. When Khrushchev exposed these crimes, did he create the possibility of genuine change, or did he merely perform a cynical political maneuver to consolidate his own power? When the delegates sat in stunned silence at 6 a.m. on February 25th, 1956, were they experiencing moral awakening or political calculation? When they returned to their offices and their dachas and their positions of privilege, did they examine their own complicity, or did they simply adjust to the new party line? The survivors of the Gulag, released after Khrushchev's speech, returned to a country that had forgotten them. Their neighbors had benefited from Stalin's system, taking their apartments, their jobs, their possessions. These neighbors did not welcome their return. The released prisoners were living accusations, reminders of crimes that everyone wanted to forget. Many could not find work. Many could not rebuild their lives. They had lost years, decades, their youth, their health, their families. Khrushchev's speech gave them nothing except the cold comfort that the state now admitted it had been wrong. The children of the executed faced impossible questions. Your father was shot as an enemy of the people. Now the state says he was innocent. Who killed him? Who signed the order? Who testified against him? Who benefited from his death? These questions had no answers, or rather, they had answers that could not be spoken. The executioners were still alive, still in positions of power, still unpunished. Khrushchev's speech created a nation of unresolved trauma, generations of people carrying grief and rage with nowhere to direct it. In 1956, a joke circulated quietly among Moscow intellectuals. A man goes to the butcher shop and asks for meat. The butcher says there is no meat. The man asks when there will be meat. The butcher says perhaps never. The man grows angry and begins shouting about the incompetence of the Soviet system. The butcher says, "Careful, comrade, in the old days, someone who talked like that would have been shot." The man leaves. The next customer asks the butcher, "Why did you threaten him?" The butcher replies, "I wasn't threatening him. I was just explaining that now we're out of bullets too." Dark humor became a survival mechanism, a way to articulate truths that could not be stated directly. The secret speech revealed that the emperor had no clothes, but it did not change the fact that everyone was still required to pretend otherwise. The system continued functioning through collective delusion, through the agreement that everyone would maintain certain fictions even though everyone knew they were lies. Khrushchev punctured one fiction, Stalin's infallibility, but left all the others intact. Western observers struggled to interpret the secret speech. Some saw it as evidence that the Soviet system could reform itself, that totalitarianism was not permanent, that change was possible from within. Some saw it as a cynical ploy, Khrushchev consolidating power by eliminating a rival who happened to be dead. Some saw it as the beginning of the end, the first admission of failure that would eventually lead to the Soviet Union's collapse. All these interpretations contained elements of truth. History is not a morality play with clear heroes and villains, clear causes and effects. It is messy, contradictory, ambiguous. The secret speech was not recorded, so no audio exists. We know it through transcripts, through written copies that circulated within the party, through the version eventually published in the West. But we do not know exactly how Khrushchev delivered it, what tone he used, where he paused, what emphasis he placed on particular passages. We do not know what the delegates' faces looked like as they listened. We do not know what they said to each other afterward, in whispered conversations in the corridors, in coded telephone calls to their colleagues in other cities. The full human reality of that night remains partially obscured, like so much of Soviet history. What we do know is that Khrushchev stood before the Communist Party and shattered the mythology that held the system together. He revealed that the great leader was a paranoid tyrant, that the wise father of the people was a mass murderer, that the infallible genius was catastrophically incompetent. And having shattered this mythology, he offered nothing to replace it except the bland assertion that Lenin would have done better, that the party would do better, that Soviet socialism remained the future of humanity despite its horrific past. The question that lingers is whether partial truth is better than complete lies. Khrushchev told some of the truth about Stalin, but not all of it. He acknowledged some crimes, but not others. He blamed one man for a system that required millions of participants. Was this progress or manipulation? Was it the beginning of genuine reform or the refinement of oppression? Can a system built on violence and lies reform itself, or can it only replace old lies with new ones? February 25th, 1956. A room full of men who built their careers on terror listen to their leader describe the terror they helped create. They sit in silence because speaking would require them to confront their own guilt. The speech ends. The delegates file out. They return to their lives. The system continues. Stalin's body still lies in Lenin's mausoleum. The secret police still operate. The labor camps still exist, though with fewer prisoners. The borders are still closed. The censorship still functions. Everything has changed. Nothing has changed. Khrushchev believed he was saving the Soviet system by exposing its crimes. Perhaps he was. The system survived another 35 years after the secret speech. But he also planted the seeds of doubt that could never be entirely suppressed. Once you admit that the party was wrong about Stalin, that the trials were fabricated, that innocent people were executed, how do you prevent people from asking what else the party might be wrong about? How do you maintain ideological certainty when you have acknowledged catastrophic failure? The secret speech was meant to strengthen the system by purging it of Stalin's legacy, but it may have instead revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Soviet communism, that a system claiming to represent truth and justice was built on lies and mass murder. In the end, what do we make of Nikita Khrushchev? A reformer or a calculating politician? A moral actor or a survivor playing the long game? A man who denounced crimes he helped commit while offering no justice to the victims? Perhaps he was all of these things simultaneously, a contradictory figure in a contradictory system, trying to change a structure he was part of, trying to speak truth while maintaining power, trying to acknowledge the past while controlling the future. The secret speech did not bring justice. It did not resurrect the dead. It did not compensate the survivors. It did not punish the guilty, but it broke a silence, and sometimes breaking silence matters even when justice remains elusive. It forced the Soviet elite to confront truths they had spent decades suppressing. It created space for questions, for doubt, for the possibility that things could be different. That space was limited, heavily controlled, frequently closed, but it existed. Was it enough? The men and women who suffered in Stalin's labor camps, who lost parents and children and lovers to the executioner's bullet, who spent years in fear and hunger and degradation, they might say no. The dissidents who continued to face persecution under Khrushchev and his successors might say no. The Hungarian rebels crushed by Soviet tanks might say no. The historians who catalog the crimes and count the bodies might say no. But perhaps the question is not whether it was enough, but whether it was something. A flawed acknowledgement, a partial truth, a small crack in an edifice of lies. History does not offer us pure moral victories or complete redemptions. It offers complicated moments where complicated people make complicated choices that produce ambiguous results. The secret speech was such a moment. It changed everything and nothing. It revealed truths while maintaining lies. It challenged power while preserving power. February 25th, 1956. 4 hours in a locked room. One man speaking. 1,436 people listening. Words that were supposed to remain secret but spread across the world. Words that acknowledged mass murder while avoiding justice. Words that shattered a myth while trying to preserve the system that created it. In the gray dawn of that February morning, as the delegates stumbled out of the hall and into the Moscow cold, did any of them understand what had just happened? Did they grasp that they had witnessed not just a political maneuver, but a moment of historical rupture, a break in the continuity of Soviet power that could never be fully repaired. The secret speech asks us to contemplate the relationship between truth and power, between acknowledgement and justice, between individual responsibility and systemic crime. It forces us to consider whether institutions built on violence can reform themselves, whether perpetrators can become reformers, whether it is possible to change a system from within when you are complicit in its crimes. These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are urgent, practical questions that recur throughout history in every society that has experienced mass atrocity and must decide how to reckon with its past. Khrushchev gave his answer. He chose partial truth over complete silence, political reform over revolutionary change, acknowledgement without justice. He bet that the Soviet system could survive its own history, that it could admit fault while maintaining legitimacy, that it could change without fundamentally transforming. For a time, this bet seemed to work. But 3 decades later, the Soviet Union collapsed, undone by the contradictions Khrushchev exposed but could not resolve. The secret speech was a beginning, not an ending. It opened questions that Soviet communism could never adequately answer. What would you have done in that room at that moment? If you were Khrushchev, how much truth would you have told? If you were a delegate, listening to crimes you may have participated in, how would you have responded? These questions are not meant to be answered easily. They are meant to remind us that history is made by people facing impossible choices, that moral clarity is often available only in hindsight, that the line between complicity and resistance is rarely clear. The secret speech endures because it captures something essential about the 20th century, the collision between ideology and reality, between utopian promises and totalitarian practice. Between the aspiration for justice and the machinery of oppression, Khrushchev stood before the Communist Party and said, "We were wrong. Our leader was a criminal. Millions died for nothing." And then he said, "But the system is sound. The party is legitimate. We will continue." This contradiction defined not just the Soviet Union, but the entire communist experiment, the attempt to build a new world while remaining trapped in the logic of power, domination, and violence. The delegates who heard the secret speech carried its burden for the rest of their lives. Some became reformers. Some became dissidents. Some remained loyal servants of the state. But all of them knew a truth they could never fully speak, that the foundation of their world was built on corpses, that their revolution had devoured its children, that the bright future they promised had become a graveyard. How do you live with that knowledge? How do you reconcile your ideals with your complicity? How do you move forward when the past is an open wound that cannot heal because it has never been properly treated? These are the questions the secret speech raises, but does not answer. They echo across decades, across borders, across political systems. They ask us to examine not just Soviet history, but our own societies, our own institutions, our own silences about injustices we prefer not to acknowledge. The secret speech is not just about Stalin or Khrushchev or the Soviet Union. It is about the human capacity for self-deception, for rationalizing evil, for participating in systems that destroy human dignity while believing we serve higher purposes. Khrushchev is dead. The Soviet Union is dead. The men who sat in that hall listening to the secret speech are dead. But the questions remain. Can truth without justice heal anything? Can acknowledgement without accountability lead to genuine change? Can those who participated in crimes lead the way to redemption? These are not rhetorical questions. They demand our attention, our engagement, our struggle to answer them in our own contexts, our own times. The secret speech was a moment when history pivoted, when the machinery of mythology briefly jammed, when truth forced its way into consciousness despite all attempts to suppress it. What happened next, the incomplete reforms, the continued repression, the eventual collapse, shows that speaking truth is necessary but not sufficient, that acknowledgement without structural change is hollow, that breaking silence matters but cannot by itself bring justice. February 25th, 1956, 4 hours that changed everything and nothing. A speech that was supposed to remain secret, but became one of the most consequential political statements of the 20th century. In that locked room, Nikita Khrushchev told the Communist Party that their God was a monster. They listened in silence, and then they went back to work, maintaining the system, preserving their power, carrying the weight of terrible knowledge that could not be transformed into meaningful action. The secret speech revealed the gap between what we know and what we do, between acknowledging wrong and making it right. That gap remains, waiting to be bridged, challenging us to do better than those who came before, to not settle for partial truths and hollow reforms, to demand that acknowledgement of injustice leads to actual justice. The question is not what Khrushchev did in 1956. The question is what we will do now, knowing what we know, seeing what we see, understanding the cost of silence and the limits of speech without action.